So I would like to welcome all of you to our July episode of Access to Answers. And today's topic is Billing Explained. And I have the privilege of introducing our facilitator and presenter today, Mr. Pat Haney. He is our Vice President of Sales at Access Systems. And as you can see, he has quite a few years in the industry, so he brings quite a bit of expertise. So, Pat, I'm going to have you take it away.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Charlie. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. And again, the purpose of these meetings that we're having is to sort of pull the covers back a little bit and be transparent and help people explain some of the processes related to the industry. And today I get the wonderful privilege of talking about contracts and invoices and billing, which is one of my favorite subjects. So I want to talk a little bit about the types of contracts, the types of agreements that you'll see out there, how the financing portion of this is done, what the service aspects of it are, any additional fees you may see, or some of the things that we see inside the industry, as well as some of the actions that you need to take at the end of the term of the contract, and then have a little bit of conversation about how those translate into invoices and the billing that you may be seeing. So first and foremost, and this one was a tough one to articulate, but when we talk about, the contracts that you have out there, so typically we're going to have an acquisition or a finance method, and the finance methods typically show up as either A, it's an agreement that you're going to purchase a piece of equipment, or B, you're going to be using a finance mechanism. And again, typically those are going to be done as leases. And in both situations where you're doing a purchase agreement or a lease agreement, you're going to want to add a service agreement to it. So, if you have a purchase, you're going to have a purchase agreement that you're going to sign with a vendor, and you're going to pay for the equipment, and then you're going to want to add a service contract. If you have a lease, it's a finance mechanism, typically run through a bank, and then there's going to be a service agreement with that. Now, over the course of the last, actually it's been a while, 10 or 15 years, we started seeing agreements come out that are bringing both of those mechanisms into a single agreement. And, as an example for us, we call it a cost per image agreement. Other people will call it a map agreement. There's varying names that you're going to see inside of those. But what those are is they're a singular agreement that has financing and service in the same agreement. And then recently, and I say that's probably been the last 4 or 5 years, we started seeing what we would call unlimited print agreements. And we'll talk specifically about the mechanics inside of each one of those. But basically, you're going to have a purchase plus service, a lease plus service. Then you're going to have potentially an agreement that is got the finance mechanism and service in it. And in some of those agreements, they might actually have an unlimited print agreement in the contract. So specifically as it relates to the finance agreements, again, leases are the most common finance option for the equipment, and leases are going to come in 2 general versions. You're either going to have an FMV lease, which is going to be a fair market value, and those leases have a little bit lower rate in them, and they're maintaining a residual on the back end, or you're going to have a buck out lease. And a buck out lease is going to give you the ability to buy the equipment at the end of the contract for a buck. So basically, that's a finance term that has no residual if you have the want or need to keep the equipment at the end of the term. Over 90% of the agreements that we see in the field are FMV. And one of the things that I do want to put out there on FMV, in FMV contracts, the finance company is actually the owner of the equipment, and in general sense, you are renting that equipment from the finance company, and you have to return that at the end of it. As far as the terms go, the standard terms are going to be 24, 36, 48, and 60. So 2-year, 3-year, 4-year, 5-year terms. And then occasionally we'll see some vendors that are out there with 63-month terms. So again, just 5 years and 3 months into it. Again, the length of term is really what's usable life of the equipment, and then what's the lowest payment you can get inside of that. There are also co-term rates available, and we could have a whole nother conversation around when's the right time to use a co-term, how do you use co-terms, but those are the general terms inside of it. As far as a straight lease goes, so this is just leasing the equipment and then having a separate service agreement. So that's a standard lease that only finances the equipment and will have no service in it. So typically, if you're going to enter into a straight lease, you're also going to sign an additional service contract. And the challenges that you'll have with that, and the reason we've moved away from doing that very often, is you're going to end up with two different contracts that you have to sign with two different terms and languages. Additionally, you're going to end up having two different invoices. So you'll have a separate lease invoice from your service invoice. The next agreement that we talked about a little bit was, the cost per image agreement or the MAP agreement. Again, these types of mechanisms will include the equipment finance and the service. And the benefit to that is you have one contract to sign, one execution date inside of the contract, and you'll end up with one invoice on that agreement. So it simplifies it, it consolidates it, it reduces the amount of language inside of it, and it simplifies the invoicing inside of that. And that's what we see most prevalent in today's market space. We talked a little bit about the unlimited print agreements. When you step back and you look at if you went with like a MAP agreement or a CPI agreement, typically those service contracts are going to have volumes inside of it, and there's going to be an allowance plus an overage charge on it. Unlimited is the same mechanism, with the exception of the fact that they're building a cost, or we're building a cost of the service into that contract, and it's a consistent payment against that service on there. So there's going to be no overage bills inside of it. So that's really the biggest difference you're going to see, is you're just going to pay a flat fee against service, not have to worry as much about the meters, and you're also not going to have overage bills on there. Private label finance is another thing I wanted to put out there. In a number of years ago, a lot of the finance companies were putting programs together to make it simpler for the customer. And private label finance is a program that got put together to give you a contract that is labeled by the dealer or the business that you're doing business with. So instead of it saying Wells Fargo, in our case, it would say Access Systems on the actual contract itself. And also all the invoices that come from, the company that initiated the contract. So in our case, it would be an invoice that would come from Access Systems. And again, most commonly, those are going to be CPI or MAP agreements or unlimited print agreements. The equipment is still being backed or financed by a finance company. So again, we'll use relationships like Great America or DLL or US Bank or Wells Fargo. They all have really good mechanisms related to private label financing. Again, it just helps the customers get a better insight on, when you get your invoice, it doesn't say it's from Wells Fargo and you're sitting there going like, oh, which Wells Fargo contract is this, so on and so forth. It'll come from Access Systems. You'll know who it is. It also gives us a lot of flexibility on the invoicing of it. So we don't have to use a standard invoice template. We can customize the invoicing for whatever your business needs are. So it's going to more directly link your invoicing and your contract to the vendor you're doing business with, as opposed to a bank or a finance company, and simplify the billing and allow us to do more customized invoicing to meet what your business needs are. Next thing I'd like to talk about a little bit is the service agreements. So again, those were the finance mechanism, the service agreements that are incorporated, that the service is there to include any parts, labor, supplies on the maintenance of the equipment you have in there. Again, the terms of the service agreements are either going to be the same thing. So again, if you had a CPI or a MAP agreement and it was a 60-month term, those things will both run hand in hand with each other. If you did do a lease with a separate service agreement, typically we're going to try to run those terms over the same period of time, so there's really good alignment with those. The different types of service agreements you might see are going to be zero allowance, which are actually billed. So you have no allowance for the equipment. They're billed on a monthly basis, and they're billed on your actual use. The benefit of that is as your volume fluctuates up and down, you're just paying for what you use. The downside to that is your bill's going to go up and down depending on what you use. And also it becomes really important to be able to make sure that you're providing accurate meters on the devices every single month, which can be a little bit laborious. The next type of agreement you might see would be an allowance with a base minimum plus overage. So typically what you'd see inside of that space is we'd sit down and we'd get a good understanding of what your consistent use is of the equipment. We'd set an allowance amount on there. So let's say you ran 100,000 pages a month. We'd say, hey, let's set that for 95% of that volume. So we might contract you for 95,000 pages. And then based on the period that that contract is on, we would look at what your actual utilization was against what that allowance is. And then if there's any overage, we would bill you for overage. Those contracts will come in monthly, quarterly, semi-annual, and annual. And most common one is going to be quarterly. And again, the benefit to doing an allowance with a base minimum plus overage, then we only, let's say we set it up as a quarterly agreement. You would only be required to make sure that we've got meter readings on a quarterly basis as opposed to a monthly basis. And the semi-annual and annual contracts are typically utilized in organizations that have high fluctuation in volume. So again, if you were a school, I'll use that as a really good example because a lot of schools will do annual, where we've got periods of time where we're using the product a lot. So typically like in September and October, they're very, very busy. They slow down a little bit in November and December. And then we've got the winter term where they're not using it for a period of time because the schools are closed, and January kicks in and the volume goes back up again. So you'd have a lot of fluctuation in volume. Summers we're not doing much. During the couple of weeks that we're taking off during Christmas and the New Year's, we're not doing much. Then other times a year, we're doing it a lot. Because there's such volume fluctuation in there, a lot of times it's easier to say, hey, let's set up an annual allowance, and then we'll true up once a year based on your utilization. And then cost per page that we have inside of the overage is going to be based on the type of device that you have. Color versus black and white, they'll have different rates, and then the monthly volume. The more volume you run, the bigger the machine you have, the lower the cost per page that's going to be on that device. The lower the volume you run, the smaller the device you have, the higher the cost per page is on that device. The service pools. So we talked a little bit about some devices having a lower CPC and some devices having a higher CPC. And what we try to do, because a lot of times there can be a wide variety of devices, is we're going to average that out. So if you had a device that costs a penny a page to service and another device that costs a penny 5 to service, we could average that out and say, hey, the average cost inside of that device is going to be a penny 25, and then we put that into a service pool. A lot of times what you will see is you will have a A3 and A4 device. And when I say that, an A3 device is going to be a larger device that has the ability to support 11 by 17 paper. Those typically have a larger cost of ownership when it comes to the purchase price of them, but a much, much lower cost in service and supplies. We're going to pool all of those devices together inside of your contract. So you'll have all of your bigger 11 by 17 devices on one pool that'll have a color and black pool inside of it. And then we're going to take your print devices, so the smaller ones that only do 8.5 by 11 and 8.5 by 14, put them in another pool, again with color and black, and then pool all the devices together to have a shared pool of copies to run against. And I've got an invoice I'm going to take you through at the end that sort of illustrates what that looks like from a billing standpoint. But that simplifies it so we don't have to have 9 different service rates, per pool, and color and black and white, and rates all over the place. We can consolidate that down typically to 2 to 4 pools, depending on whether you have color or how much A3 and A4 you have, and it simplifies the billing a lot and allows a shared pool against that allowance. Additionally, I'll talk a little bit about escalations. Most of the contracts that are out there are going to have a form of escalation on there. So escalations are, we're going to start at a service rate. Typically, that's a very low service rate or a really competitive market service rate. And then over time, as the equipment starts to age, the cost of servicing those devices is going to increase, and we will have annual escalations. So at every anniversary of that contract, you'll see a small escalation. They typically are anywhere from 5 to 20%, depending on the contract that you're working with. And the importance of having those escalations is it allows us to be able to utilize lower rates at the beginning of a contract. When a device is very new, it's not going to have many problems. Things are going to run really well, so there's a lower cost of supporting that. But then as the device ages, we'll also see increases in parts and supply costs. We'll have increased expense based on device age or number of service calls, because labor is a big component of servicing that. And most importantly, and I like to put this out there when I have a conversation with anybody about this, is we have really good technicians. They're really good people. They're working really hard. They'd love to progress their careers, and we like to give them pay raises every year. And this also allows us to continue to retain really high quality technicians over long periods of time, because our contracts will increase a little bit in cost, which allows us to give pay raises to our techs, as well as burden some of the costs against parts increases, supply increases, so on and so forth. Additional fees. So a lot of times you hear about like, oh, hidden fees. I didn't know about this. I didn't know about that. So I'm going to put all the fees that we typically see out there and just sort of throw them out there as things for you to ask people about or have conversations around. The first one is going to be a lease origination fee. Again, depending on the type of contract you're working with, so everything basically outside of a purchase, there is a lease origination fee, and that's through the finance company as well as the dealers. We have to add you into the system. There's work in getting all the information into the system, getting all the paperwork done, making sure that we can bill you appropriately. And the contracts will typically see anywhere from $100 to $175 one-time fee for processing and handling of that lease origination. Additionally, you're going to see supply freight fees on a lot of the invoices. And again, these are not profit centers for the companies. These are just us trying to cover the cost of the shipping of supplies, the shipping of parts, those types of things. And again, it's going to typically be a fee that is going to be on your invoice on a monthly basis. Most organizations are picking a flat number for that based on the number of devices, number of locations. It's not an actual charge against the actual cost of shipping. If we tried to do that, that would get really complicated from a billing standpoint. So what we do as a business is we look at what our overall cost burden is for the shipping of supplies and parts. And we average that out and take that against the number of devices, and then add that to contracts based on number of devices and locations inside of a customer's fleet. Next thing, you're going to have tax. So again, when you're signing a contract, you'll have on there, whether it's a purchase agreement or it's a lease agreement or a MAP or a CPI agreement, you'll have a monthly fee on there. Those do not reflect taxes. So again, taxes are complicated. If you bought a piece of equipment and you're in the state of Illinois and you're shipping that piece of equipment over to California, there's different laws that we have to adhere to from a taxing standpoint. So it would be very complicated for our organization to figure out all the taxes on the front side. So again, the contract will have the stated charge for the equipment and the services. Taxes will get added to that as appropriate in your invoice. You do also sometimes see fuel surcharges, and actually recently we've started seeing some tariff fees. So during periods of time where there's increased cost related to the shipping of product, or in this case, some of the tariffs have increased a lot of the costs related to that. There are times where we will start adding fuel surcharges or tariffs. They don't happen very often, but I have actually seen some invoices come across my desk here in the last few months where there's literally a line item for some of the tariffs. And again, this isn't a situation where somebody's trying to gouge or take more money away. We're just trying to work against the cost burdens that we're seeing and some of the fluctuations and changes. And they're definitely something, if you do see it, it's a fair conversation to call your vendor up and ask them what's going on, and get a better understanding of what's happening there. They'll also see some optional charges. And I'll speak specifically to a couple of the charges that we include on our contracts. So we have a secure data protection on our contract, as well as connectivity assurance. These are two things that are optional. You have to actually select them, and there are fees. And the secure data protection, which is something that I think everybody should be taking a look at, are programs that we have in place that will that when we take the devices out of your location, we're ensuring that all of the information that's sitting on that device, whether it's in the hard disk drive or non-volatile memory, or any of the settings that are the devices, any of the usernames and passwords that we use to connect to things like email servers, Active Directory for user authentication, those types of things, that we're removing all of that information from the device prior to it leaving any of our warehouses, to make sure that when the device at the end of the lease ends up at a distributor, that it's not being shipped off with any personal information on it. Connectivity insurance is another one that I think is really beneficial for organizations to look at. Can't print in today's environment isn't just device related. It could be all sorts of things. It could be driver related. It could be firmware related. It could be network infrastructure related. It could be desktop related. It could be print server related. And the connectivity insurance is an additional charge for us to be able to utilize our NOC technicians. So we have a whole bunch of network technicians that are available on our NOC to take the calls, and they're specifically IT related technicians, not necessarily just engine or device related technicians, that understand network infrastructure, drivers, print server setup, those types of things, so that when somebody says, hey, I hit print and the piece of paper didn't come out, we can help troubleshoot all the way down from the application all the way to the device and help you resolve that problem. So again, a couple of things that I think are really beneficial, but at choice. And again, we see a lot of other businesses doing the same thing. So it's something you should definitely take into consideration when you're looking at the contracts and what the capabilities are. End of term. So we talked about the contracts, we talked about the leasing side of it, we talked about the service side of it. You've entered into an engagement, with the vendor, you're in a contract with that. At the end of the term, there are a lot of responsibilities on your part as a customer to work with the vendor as well as with the finance company to make sure that at the end of the contract, everything is going well. So first and foremost, none of these contracts start until delivery and installation has been completed. And then you sign on the delivery and installation portion of it that it's been done. Once delivery and installation is completed and you've signed off on delivery and installation, then that contract will be sent to the financing partner, and they will start the billing process on that. So they'll actually fund the lease and start payment and invoicing over to you, the customer. Then at the end of the term, which typically is going to be stated at the end of or in the language, the terms and conditions of the contract, there is a period that you need to notify the vendor that you no longer want to continue with the contract. All of the contracts that you're looking at are going to have an evergreen or an auto renewal clause at the end of it. And that's actually for your benefit, not necessarily for the purpose of the bank or for us. It's actually for the customer. And those renewals can be anywhere from month to month to annual. I have seen a few of them that run the full term of the contract. Please look for that type of language in the agreement. And if you see it, redline it and ask them to do an annual or a month to month. But the benefit to having the renewal in there is it allows you some flexibility on timing of the end of the contract. So again, if you've got a contract that was ending in September, and you wanted new equipment, you can send the letter of intent to the vendor that, hey, I don't want to renew this lease anymore. I'm going to make all the payments through the end of the contract, and you can work with the vendor to make sure that they're getting all the new product in there, getting the old product, out of there. And let's just say something ran a month longer than you wanted it to. By having a month-to-month or an escalate or a renewal at the end of it, it allows you the flexibility to be able to do that. If these contracts didn't have a auto renewal at the end of them, literally what would happen is the day your contract ended, they'd have to bring trucks out there, pick up all your equipment, whether you had equipment or not, and pull it out. So again, it's to your benefit to have that language in there. And then the return of the equipment. The other thing that's clearly stated inside of all of the contracts is it is on you as the customer. It is your responsibility to return the equipment. Again, these devices are owned by the bank, and the bank is going to ask for that to be returned at the end of it. If it's an FMV, if it's a buck out, you can buy it for $1. But again, most of them are going to be FNB. So it's on you to get that returned to the vendor or the leasing company at the end of the contract. So it's something to be aware of. So the general process is, when you get towards the end of your term, you're going to look to the notification period. Again, that's typically going to be 60 to 90 days. You'll send a letter of intent to the vendor stating that you don't want to renew the contract. Then you're going to get a return authorization letter from the bank saying that we would like this return within this period of time to this location. And then you can either work with your new vendor or your existing vendor, as well as you can work with a shipping company to get that arranged to send back to them. But those are the general processes that you need to go down at the end of the term of your contract. Invoices. So I talk a little bit about invoicing, and I'm going to be relatively brief in this. I do have a sample invoice that I wanted to show you. This is one of ours. So the first thing, you'll notice it says Access Systems up in the top of it. That's because this is a private label finance agreement that I'm showing you. This could be funded through Wells Fargo or Great America or DLL, but the invoices will come from us on our part so that you understand who it is. It's going to show you what the invoice number is in there, what the invoice date. So this is when we shipped it to you, and then what the balance due is in. And generally, up on the top of it, this is the account number. That's you, the term on it, the date that it's actually due. So typically within 30 days, because this is a net 30, and then what the invoice amount is, and then the contract that this invoice is pertaining to, and then what the actual contract amount was. So this was the dollar amount that's actually sitting on the contract. And then some of them will have start dates and expiration dates. In this case, the start date was 3/15 of 23. We didn't have an expiration date on the sample invoice, but a lot of times you will see expiration dates on those. And as you look further down in the invoice, this is where we're going to start seeing all of the devices. So in this case, we've got a couple of different Sharps. And these are going to be in the same pool. So in this case, it was a Sharp C7045, and this device was this device number here. This device is this number right there. We clearly made those up. This is what the serial number's on there, and this is where the pools come in. So we've got your black and white pool. It shows the beginning meter and the end meter on this device, and then again, the same pool. So the group 1 black and white, group 1 color. And then this was the starting meter and the ending meter of that device. And depending on the number of devices you have, the contracts are going to show, or the invoices are going to show all of the different invoices on there. And then they'll have a summary page at the end of it. So the summary page at the end of it is then going to say, The total devices that are in group 1 black and white, which in this case was the 2 devices that we showed you earlier. These were their beginning meters. These were their end meters. This was the total copies that were run on there. At the top of this, you'll see that the total copies were 49,100. The covered copies in the contract was 31,500. So there were 17,600 copies billable. The rate they were billable at was 005, which equals $88. And then it would do the same thing on those same 2 devices for their color. And then we go down here where we had another pool. So this was a group 2 pool of black and white devices. This would be like a bunch of HP printers or some Sharp printers or some Lexmark printers that you had in there. And it's going to show all of the devices begin reads, end reads, total number of copies. And again, the total copies that were allowed on this were 50,553, or used were 50,553. The allowance was 51,000. So the billable copies was 0 because it wasn't over the contract amount. So that's going to be the standard agreement amount. And then at the bottom of the agreement, you're going to see the actual charges. Let me go all the way to the bottom. You're going to see the actual charge that was on the contract, which was the $388.94 plus the taxes on it. And that's going to be a total of $416.17, which again, at the top of the bill, that's what the balance due was on that. So hopefully you've got some good insight on some of the different agreements that are out there. Gives you some good insight on what might be the best route for you to go, whether it's a purchase or a lease or the service contract or a CPI or a MAP agreement or an unlimited agreement. So again, appreciate your time. Appreciate you taking a view at this. And if you have any questions, don't ever hesitate to reach out. We'd be happy to talk to you.